Hello and welcome to Mexican wolf genetics and the losses caused by politicized management. My name is Erin Hunt with Lobos of the Southwest. I'm joining from the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay, also known as San Diego, California. I'll be moderating our presentations today and our Q&A. We are recording today and we will share that with everyone as soon as that's done processing. So expect a little email from me a little later this week. 2023 marks the 25th anniversary of the reintroduction of Mexican gray wolves, or Lobos, into the wild in the American Southwest. Predator eradication efforts nearly wiped them out, but through a carefully managed captive breeding effort and reintroduction program, Lobos have been restored to parts of their former range in the southwestern US and Mexico. These rare southwestern native wolves have overcome many challenges in the race against extinction, including reaching a record of at least 241 wolves in Arizona and New Mexico by the end of 2022. I want to give a shout out to the Mexican Wolf Species Survival Plan and the Mexican Wolf Interagency Field Team and Recovery Program for all of the work and the successes that we've had over these 25 years. But our work is not done to help Mexican gray wolves thrive and roam freely in the wild places where they belong. I'd also like to acknowledge our conservation partners who helped make our celebrations for the 25th anniversary possible and who work tirelessly every day to conserve Lobos. We want to give special thanks to the Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project, Wolf Conservation Center, Defenders of Wildlife, the Center for Biological Diversity, Project Coyote, the Rewilding Institute, New Mexico Wild, Upper Gila Watershed Alliance, and Wild Arizona, and our volunteer advocates, Roz Switzer and Jean and Peter Osorio, for all this extra help with our 25th anniversary events that are coming to a close this week. But we've got many more conservation partners listed. And if you're interested in finding out more about the organizations who help support this work every day, you can visit MexicanWolves.org for more information about our collaborative efforts to save Lobos in the wild. During today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Dr. Philip Hedrick, who is Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University, and Michael Robinson of the Center for Biological Diversity. So I'll introduce the two of them before their talks. Participants will be muted for best audio quality, but you can ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box and clicking send. We will pause between presentations for some questions, and we'll open up the floor again for more questions towards the end of the webinar. All right. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Philip Hedrick. Dr. Hedrick is Emeritus Professor at Arizona State University. From 1992 until his retirement, he was Ullman Professor of Conservation Biology at ASU. Dr. Hedrick has published over 200 articles on the topics of population genetics and conservation biology. His research focuses on the conservation genetics of endangered species and the genetic bases of evolutionary processes. Recent projects in his laboratory have examined the effects of inbreeding and outbreeding on fitness-related characteristics in Sonoran top minnows, Mexican and red wolves, and bighorn sheep. So Dr. Hedrick, we're gonna transition to you for screen sharing. If you would like to go ahead and do that. All right, Dr. Hedrick, if you want to go ahead and start your slideshow and unmute yourself, we are thrilled to hear your presentation today. Thank you so much.
You hearing me now?
Yes, you're perfect. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. I was going to talk about some of the work that's been done on the genetics of Mexican wolves. I was on two Mexican wolf recovery teams, and my main role was to think about the genetics and how that would impact their recovery. And I've worked on, as you said, genetics in other wolves as well. So let me start by, let's see. I can't, I'm not getting it to forward.
Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay.
Oh, there we go. So here's a map of occupied wolf range. You can see the green there in northern gray wolves, and then there's a small area down in New Mexico and Arizona where Mexican wolves are. And then the suitable wolf habitat is hatched in red. And so you can see that mainly the area between Mexican wolves and northern gray wolves that's unoccupied is in Colorado. And so one of the ideas from the Mexican wolf recovery teams I was on is to reestablish wolves from the northwest up in the northern gray wolves to the southwest, the Mexican wolves. And so that would be mainly recovery of wolves in Colorado. And so two of the areas that would be have wolves would be northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and north rim of the Grand Canyon. And the recovery teams I was on, that was our idea, to have really three core populations, one where they are today, and then those other two further north. So here's another map focusing more on northern gray wolves and Mexican wolf distribution, and then the potential habitat in green. So the northern gray wolves were basically eliminated from most of the US. And then they were reintroduced from British Columbia and Alberta in the middle 90s. And these wolves were released in Yellowstone, Idaho, and then there was natural reestablishment in Montana. Right now, there's about 2,000 wolves in the Northern Rockies, and 300 of those are in Washington, Oregon, the rest in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. And there were about, this year, about 100 wolves in 9 packs in Yellowstone. And so in the greater Yellowstone, there's on the order of 500. So here's a older map of all the packs, and you can see in the center there, Yellowstone, and then the packs are all numbered around Yellowstone. So you can see they're pretty widely distributed in these states in the northern gray wolves. Here's Doug Smith. This is the lead, he was a lead wolf biologist for Yellowstone. He just retired, and with a radio-collared wolf. So he was a big part of the effort to reintroduce and see how successful the wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone was. And I just thought I'd put in a photo of a pack of Yellowstone wolves. There's 8 black ones and 8 gray ones. And one thing I was working on for years is understanding the genetics of this difference. And the black wolves are the result of. And so there seemed to be in our analysis a great proportion of black versus gray matings, more than that would be expected. The Mexican wolves are the most distinct and the smallest of the gray wolf subspecies. They went extinct in the US in the 70s and in Mexico in the early 80s. The captive population, there's around 300. They're in zoos and other facilities. They're descended from 3 different lineages called the McBride, Aragon, and Ghost Ranch. The McBride is the main lineage, and it is descended from 3 founders itself. And the other 2 are just descended from 2 founders. So very small genetic base for these different lineages. Mexican wolves were reintroduced in 1998 into Arizona and New Mexico. And there were 13 wolves originally and more released in later years. So smaller numbers in the northern gray wolves and a little bit later. The present population of Mexican wolves is around 200, a little bit more from the latest surveys. And here's a historic map of the distribution of Mexican wolves. So you can see that it goes up into Arizona and New Mexico. And our thinking on the recovery team is that with climate change and evaluating the habitat, Mexican wolves could go further north than this, like I was saying, into the north rim of Grand Canyon, southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, beyond this range. And here's a photo of the release with Bruce Babbitt and Jamie Rappaport Clark releasing Mexican wolves. So it's a historic photo. I was also there at that time. So I was going to talk briefly about different ways to evaluate genetics in wolves and in Mexican wolves. And so here's another map, just you can see the north rim of the Grand Canyon up to the upper left, and then the area in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, where we were thinking about other populations would be established. So there's three basic ways to think about genetics in this situation. And I'm going to first talk about amount of genetic variation in general. And so one way you can establish that is to do what's called genomic studies, look at molecular variation. And so that's been done in Mexican wolves and compared to northern gray wolves. And so if we look at the genomic heterozygosity, this is something that has a range from 0 to 1. In Mexican wolves, it's pretty small, 0.12 on average. Northern gray wolves is almost twice as much. So the proportion is of Mexican to northern is about 0.55. It really is a big difference. And to get this difference, you have to have what's called a bottleneck of just 2 individuals for 2 generations to get that much reduction. So it's a very small number of individuals, if they were taken from the northern gray wolves, to establish the Mexican gray wolf population to lead to this reduction. So this is a genomic estimate of the amount of reduction in variation in Mexican gray wolves. Another way you can think about it is to look at a pedigree analysis of what we have of the captive animals in the Mexican wolves. And so, as I said, there were 3 lineages with 7 total founders. And if we do pedigree analysis, we can see that most of the ancestry is from the McBride lineage. That's what we expected. But it's very unequal, Aragon and Ghost Ranch. But beyond that, there's inbreeding and loss of variation in all 3 of these lineages. And so if we calculate what we call the number of founder equivalents, it's only 2.1, very low. So it's if we just had 2 individuals that contribute to all the genetic variation in the Mexican wolves. So that kind of goes along with what we saw from the genomic analysis. This is pedigree analysis. So they both give us these very low amounts of genetic variation. So the next thing we can do is look at what we call inbreeding. So in the McBride lineage, we have a pedigree, and over time, we can see what the inbreeding level is. And so inbreeding level goes from 0 if its parents are unrelated to 1 where there's very high genetic identity. And so the McBride lineage starts out pretty low, and then it goes up to about 0.25, which is like if you had offspring from a brother-sister mating. So that's what 0.25 inbreeding coefficient is. And so that was getting pretty high. And that's one reason why the other 2 lineages, here's the Ghost Ranch and the Aragon lineage, Ghost Ranch in blue. And you can see it's very inbred. The inbreeding coefficient was all the way up to 0.7. Aragon was inbred, but not as much. And so we have 3 different lineages, all of them quite inbred. but they're descended from different founders. So if you cross them, then the offspring are considered not to be inbred. So that's what was done. And then here, if you look at the green down at the bottom, that's the cross lineage population of Mexican wolves that was based on the crosses between these three lineages, McBride, Aragon, and Ghost Ranch. And what's happened since this these data here, the cross lineage wolves have had inbreeding coefficient has increased, and it's about 0.25 now. So even in the cross lineage wolves, which are the wolves that we have in the zoos and in the wild now, inbreeding coefficient is quite high. So that's the second way of measuring genetic variation, thinking about it. And then the third thing is talking about what we call inbreeding depression. So if you have inbreeding, it can have an effect on fitness values like reproduction, mating, survival, and so forth. And here's an example of the litter size being impacted by inbreeding. So F is inbreeding level, and it starts out with low inbreeding with about low inbreeding initially. The litter size is almost 5 to the left of this in the yellow. Then high inbreeding in the McBride wolves, the litter size declines. But then if you cross them between the lineages, we get what's called genetic rescue. So that's what the F1 times F1 is. And you can see in the blue on the right, we now have higher litter size. So this is how inbreeding affects one of the components of fitness. And here's another example of how it's affected the reintroduced population. So the inbreeding coefficient of pups is along the horizontal axis. And you can see when it's low, the litter size is high, about 0.4 to the left. And then when the inbreeding coefficient is higher, down to the right, the litter size is lower. So this is the way genetics is affecting actual fitness characteristics. So this probably affects other traits as well. This is the one that was the most easily measured. So I wanted to say one other thing about inbreeding depression. There's been some suggestion that there isn't as much inbreeding depression. It's hard to measure, of course, when we don't have large samples. But the other thing is that there's been what's called supplemental feeding of denning wolves. And so when you do that, it makes it much harder to detect inbreeding depression, because the environment's not as difficult for the wolves as a natural environment. So they don't have to forage, they don't have to acquire food and so forth. And so at the bottom, I've got kind of a numerical example of how environmental factors affect relative fitness. And if you look at that first line, if for inbred individuals that are fed, then we can just say that the relative fitness is 1. This is just kind of a way of thinking about it. And then if they're inbred and still fed, there's a slight reduction in the fitness, but not much. And so it's 90% of the fed ones. But if you look at 90% of the non-inbred ones, but then if you look at where in a natural environment where they have to acquire their food and forage, then the non-inbreds, their relative fitness is lower, but the inbreds in a natural environment, their fitness is even lower. So it goes from 0.5 to 0.2. And so the ratio of the inbred to non-inbred is really significantly, has a significant effect in a wild natural environment. Whereas in a fed environment, which was being done, you don't see the effect of inbreeding nearly as much. So this is an important point to keep in mind that, it's hard to detect inbreeding depression because of sample size, but here, if you change the environment, it may not be present in an artificial environment, where in the natural environment, it would be important. And that's, of course, what we're interested in. So I wanted to say just a couple things about this goal of introducing Mexican wolves and having them spread and interacting with northern gray wolves. So the goal of what I thought was important for the recovery of Mexican wolves is to have this kind of gradation between northern gray wolves and Mexican wolves in adaptation and ancestry. And so the assumptions of this are that northern gray wolves are adapted to their ancestral environment in the north. So the ones in Yellowstone and so forth, they're best adapted to that area. Mexican wolves are adapted to their ancestral environment in the south. And this is prey-based environment and so forth. And that historically, there were wolves all the way north-south adaptation and ancestry from the north to the south. So the goal, as far as recovery in our mind on the recovery teams, was to reestablish this gradient of adaptation and ancestry. One thing you have to think about if you're doing this is that, like I've been talking, Mexican wolves are inbred. So it seems like their fitness is probably somewhat compromised. So we have to keep that in mind when this gradation is reestablished from north to south. And as a result, ancestry of northern gray wolves and Mexican wolves should be monitored in this area where in Colorado or northern New Mexico and so forth, where the two subspecies interbreed. And this gradient is reestablished. So this is not new to idea for Mexican wolves and gray wolves. This is the same approach that was used in Texas in Florida for the Florida panther and the Texas cougars. There we had a few Texas cougars left, on the order of 20. Florida panthers left, and then we had Texas cougars brought in to reestablish good, healthy genetic variation. And this was even more difficult because it was just one population. And in the gray wolf, Mexican wolf situation, there's a whole series of populations, and we can monitor this population by population as this gradation is established. So this is kind of the overall perspective that I see as far as understanding how Mexican wolves genetics can be improved by interaction with northern gray wolves. And then I was just going to show this as a last photo. This is Mike Phillips and Doug Smith and the release of wolves in Yellowstone in the middle 90s. Thanks very much.
Stop sharing screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hedrick. I do have some questions coming in. Would you like to keep your photo up, or would you like to go to our faces for answering a few questions here before we move forward?
Stop sharing your screen.
Oh, so let's stop share. Okay, how's that?
All right. So I'll read out our questions here in the chat. I do also want to, this isn't quite a question, but I think it's a great point. So I wanted to share one of the comments is that we don't want to forget the workers who made the relationships happen to release the wolves. CEOs and governors get photo ops, but it's on the ground relationship building that make all of these sticky problems and really challenging dynamics fruitful enough to do this work. So I just wanted to thank Erica for that comment. I think that's a really wonderful point. In terms of questions for you though, Dr. Hedrick, we have a question that says, your graph showed the outdated Fredrickson 2006 analysis. A rigorous peer-reviewed statistical analysis of all available data in 2016 found no significant relationship between maximum observed pup count and inbreeding coefficient of pups. This was true for litters that did not receive supplemental feeding. Given this updated analysis, can you explain how inbreeding is impacting recovery?
Well, like I said, it's difficult to have numbers enough to certify that there's really inbreeding depression. And I think with the low amount of variation that you have in Mexican wolves compared to northern gray wolves, it's likely for some inbreeding or some fitness component, there is inbreeding depression. So I assume that someone that's had access to most recent data, but I haven't been able to get that data and analyze it. But I don't know why the inbreeding depression would all of a sudden disappear. There hasn't been new genetic variation brought in. And so to say that some miracle has happened and all of a sudden we don't have inbreeding depression is pretty unlikely in my mind.
Thank you, Dr. Hedrick. We've got a few more questions for you. So we'll have a few more minutes of questions and then we'll move into Michael Robinson's presentation, but we will have more time for questions at the end. So if we don't get to your question right now, don't worry, we'll have some more time at the end. So a second question, how much of the adaptation to the environment is genetic and how much arises from birth location?
It's difficult to know. I mean, both of those are important. So both genetics and environment contribute. So I don't have a specific answer, but I would say certainly genetics is important. So we need to keep track of that as well. The ancestry of Mexican wolves and northern gray wolves. So I think you have to think about it as, like I was saying, monitoring what goes on as far as reestablishment of this gradation. You don't want to just hope that it cures everything. You want to monitor. That's what happened with the Florida Panther situation. So you have long-term data set and you keep track of what's going on.
Thank you, Dr. Hedrick. Let's see. Question, how long have Mexican wolves been in the US?
Well, of course, they were extirpated. So they were extirpated in the 70s. And so the reintroduction really took place in the late 90s. Before that, they were in captivity in the US. So 1998 was when the first reintroduction took place.
Thank you, Dr. Hedrick. So let's see, maybe time for a couple more questions here. And then we will circle back and have some more time at the end. So don't worry if I don't get to you. Kind of a comment and maybe a question from me. We've got a thank you from one of our attendees. So thank you for the informative talk. It seems to me that it would help Mexican gray to head up north and find mates in northern gray wolves. I would sure welcome them in Colorado. So thanks to a Colorado resident for joining us today. So Dr. Hedrick, could you maybe speak a little bit to where would be the optimal places for this intermingling of northern gray wolves and Mexican gray wolves to take place? What geographic locations would be best for that to support both Mexican wolf recovery and the further dispersal of northern gray wolves through their former range?
Well, when I was on the recovery team, we proposed that there be 3 subpopulations, and one would be in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. And the people at Turner Foundation were involved at that point, Mike Phillips. And so the idea was to have a population established there in northern New Mexico, and then they would spread further north and interbreed with northern gray wolves that would be coming from the north. So I'm not a person to ask about where in Colorado would be a good place to release wolves, but that was when we were talking about it on the recovery team. That was our goal, was to have a self-sustaining subpopulation that would be potentially interbreeding with northern gray wolves that were coming from the north.
Thank you. Okay, maybe one more question before we move on. So in 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began cross-fostering captive-born pups into wild litters. Have there been any genetic studies on the impacts that this has had on the wild population?
I, at one point, tried to look at that data. So what was done previous to that is that females and her pups were introduced. And so the survival of those sometimes was not as good as we would like. I think it was on the order of 30%, something like that. So it was difficult, even though there were multiple individuals involved, female and several pups. So that was the survival was somewhat higher from cross-fostering. So when young pups were cross-fostered into a litter that was out in the wild, one of the problems I remember is that they were not picked because of genetic basis at all. So when you were moving a female and her litter mate and her litter, you knew what their genetics were, and you picked ones that were going to contribute more. And the ones that were cross-fostered were picked because they were just available. There might be, say, a pup the right age in St. Louis, and so it was brought out to be cross-fostered. So genetics was not the main goal in the cross-fostering situation, and there was usually just one individual that was cross-fostered into a litter at a time. So the impact didn't seem to be as much, and the goal was not genetically oriented as much. So I think it probably has worked to some extent, and I've never been able to evaluate it in detail to know how much impact it's had genetically. But I would say it probably has had some, but I'm not sure that for all the effort and time and expense that it's been a fruitful situation. Someone should evaluate that in more detail.
Thank you, Dr. Hedrick. Definitely an important area for continued research to evaluate the effectiveness of all the techniques that we use to support Lobo recovery in the wild. So thank you. I do want to acknowledge we do have some additional questions, so we will circle back to those. I see you. I will promise we will get back to your questions for those who've dropped that into the chat. I will read out, I think this is kind of a direct response. The SSP last year reported that inbreeding coefficient and genetic diversity improved in the wild population, and mean kinship remained the same from 2021 to 2022. Founder genome equivalence was the only metric that declined, 2.87 to 2.85. Since fostered pups, 83 to date, are specifically produced to be the most genetically valuable, would you agree that fostered pups from captivity are the most likely reason for these improvements?
I'm not familiar with that. That sounds reasonable to me, but yeah, if those were, for whatever reason, genetically important individuals that were brought in, that could increase the founder genome equivalence. It's still, 2.85 is that's like less than 3 individuals are contributing all the basis of the genetic variation in Mexican wolves. I mean, that's, in the scheme of things, I mean, that's, I don't know, maybe someone knows of other species that have that small a genetic base, but it's very low compared to other endangered species, whether you're talking about California condors or black-footed ferrets or whatever. So it's very, very low.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hedrick. So we will circle back. We'll have some more questions for you and then some general questions at the end as well. But I do want to welcome our next presenter for now. So I'd like to introduce Michael Robinson, who is representing the Center for Biological Diversity as a senior conservation advocate working on the protection and recovery of top predators like Mexican gray wolves and jaguars, as well as more obscure animals and plants such as the bracted twist flower in central Texas that was placed on the threatened species list yesterday. Michael lives in rural southwestern New Mexico within walking distance of the Gila National Forest, where Mexican wolves roam. Michael's also the author of Predatory Bureaucracy, The Extermination of Wolves and the Transformation of the West, a history that was published by the University Press of Colorado. So Michael, we can go ahead and get started with your screen sharing and get you going.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erin. Thank you, Dr. Hedrick. Thank you to all our attendees today. I am going to go into a bit of a recount of how management has unfolded and where it is now, and how that has influenced the genetic plight of the Mexican wolf. But I want to just precede that by jumping back a little bit to at least one of the questions that we just heard. And I understand that we have among our many attendees and guests today, we have representatives from Arizona Game and Fish Department, and perhaps they are among those who sent in inquiries forward. In particular, the very first question was puzzling to me because it referred to 2016 genetic analysis that did not involve fed wolves, and the questioner asserted that in fact it showed that inbreeding depression was not affecting reproduction. I'm aware of a 2016 analysis by the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, but it did involve fed wolves, and that was used in the somewhat unscientifically founded recovery plan that came out shortly afterward. So if there is new data from unfed wolves in 2016, I'm sure we would all be very happy to look at that. But I'm not sure that the question actually had the full basis of information that I'm aware exists in that instance. That said, I will jump into my presentation here and take just a moment. All right, oops. Okay, I trust everybody can see a Mexican wolf on their screen in front of them. As Erin mentioned, I'm with Center for Biological Diversity. We're a nonprofit conservation organization. And what we do is we examine what's happening with imperiled animals and plants. We investigate their status and oftentimes their decline. And we take a stand to ensure that they'll always be a part of our world, that they aren't going to disappear into the black night of extinction. And at this point, the Mexican wolf really does need our attention, because notwithstanding some very good news, which I'll talk about in just a moment, that wolf numbers are now over 240 in the wild in the Southwest, the long-term prognosis, because of the genetics that we've been learning about right now, are not so positive for the Mexican wolf. And it's important to realize Mexican wolves truly are unique. Pioneering ecologist Aldo Leopold, decades ago, before there was genetic analysis per se, he identified, or he called the Mexican wolf the desert wolf, because it is, as Dr. Hedrick indicated, it is adapted to more southern environments. It's smaller. It's got a range of colors on its coat that's doesn't include pure white or pure black, as in wolves and some wolves elsewhere. And it has been found, as Dr. Hedrick has done some of the pioneering, probably I think the pioneering research on this, to be genetically unique. And let's be clear about why Mexican wolves declined. It was the introduction of livestock that coincided with the rapid killing, largely through market hunting, of the Mexican wolf and other wolves' natural prey, that led wolves all throughout the West to turn to livestock and prey heavily on them. And that led to persecution against the wolves. At first, it was of individuals and of states and counties that offered bounties to kill the wolves off. But then, starting in 1915, the United States government began hiring hundreds of full-time trappers and poisoners whose job was the extinction of wolves, including in the Southwest. And this post nailed to a tree in central New Mexico really encapsulates the story. United States Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Biological Survey, Predatory Animal Control. Notice, please do not interfere with steel traps in this locality. The government is going to much expense in an effort to exterminate the wild animals, and the cooperation of the public is desired in seeing that traps of the hunters are not disturbed. signed by a government trapper. And this is what it looked like. One by one, with the unlimited funds of the United States government, the wolves were tricked into stepping into traps. Others were poisoned along with coyotes and other animals that were targeted. And the bottom line is that this program that began in 1915, near the beginning of World War, didn't conclude with the death of the last wild wolf in the Western United States until the end of another World War in 1945, when the last likely wild-born wolf in the Western U.S. was killed in southern Colorado and near the edge of the today's South San Juan wilderness. And yet wolves still came across from Mexico, where this concerted effort, centrally directed effort, did not exist, into areas such as the Boot Heel of New Mexico and Animas Mountain, and into the Peloncillo Mountains that crest along the Arizona-New Mexico border and extend south of the international border as well. And wolves that showed up were killed by the U.S. government. They had a government hunter and trapper who was killing bobcats and coyotes and whatever else until there was a report of a wolf in the U.S. And then he dropped everything and stationed along the border to make sure that any wolf that came over flight. And then starting in 1950, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which was the continuation of this Bureau of Biological Survey that had been doing this, began exporting its government concocted poisons to Mexico to kill wolves in the vast Sierra Madres of Mexico. And that led to a rapid decline in the number of wolves crossing the border from Mexico to the US, which was the whole point of this. They decided they would just exterminate them at the source. And that would have been the end of the Mexican wolf, except for the fact that the American public was being awakened to this mindless persecution and as well as the reckless destruction of habitats that was leading to a lot of other species going extinct. And President Richard Nixon in 1972 proposed a new law to protect endangered wildlife and even plants, and Congress held hearings throughout 1972 and 1973 and passed the Endangered Species Act at the end of 1973 to take affirmative steps for the government, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to take affirmative steps to recover animals and plants that are trending toward extinction, and also to conserve the ecosystems on which threatened species and endangered species depend. That was written and is written into the law that passed 50 years ago. And government biologists with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they had been spending significant effort to kill the last wolves. So they realized there weren't very many of them left. They hired a trapper a U.S. trapper who'd done a lot of his work killing wolves in Mexico. And between 1977 and 1980, he was able to capture 6 wolves in Mexico. One of these wolves died in his trap. He wasn't used to keeping animals alive. Of the remaining 5, 4 of them were male and only one of them was female. Well, they did manage to get her pregnant. And of those last 5, there were 3, and that's the McBride lineage, named after Roy McBride, who was the trapper who captured them, that Dr. Hedrick had mentioned the McBride lineage. 3 of those were ultimately successfully bred. And then the other 2 lineages that Dr. Hedrick mentioned, the Aragon and, sorry, I'm forgetting for just a moment the name of the other one, but they stemmed from wolves that had been captured in Aragon. I'm sorry, forget the name of that. But anyway, they were both from lineages that stemmed from wolves that had been captured decades previously. But they each stemmed from 2 wolves that had been bred over the course of decades. So 2 + 2 + 3 is where we get to 7 founding animals. The 1982 Mexican wolf recovery plan essentially said that the Mexican wolf was so close to extinction that it was hard to actually envision what recovery would look like, what criteria would mark successful recovery. And the authors of this, and it was a binational recovery plan with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and its counterpart in Mexico that signed off on it and helped develop it. They said that as a first step, there should be 2 populations, viable populations, although they didn't define what that would be established through reintroduction in the historic range of the Mexican wolf in the U.S. and or Mexico, but that wouldn't signal the end of that they actually didn't define of what recovery would take place. Ultimately, reintroduction in the U.S. took the Mexican wolf into an area that had not just the deer and the javelina in the desert areas that wolves had been captured from in Mexico and in the very southern parts of Arizona and New Mexico, but also elk as a possible other food source for wolves that were reintroduced up on the Mogollon Plateau, the Gila National Forest, and the Apache National Forest in respectively western New Mexico and eastern Arizona. A forested landscape where they could be placed back. And here's another photo of them being brought back in 1998, including Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt there with on the right-hand side of the image, and Jamie Rappaport Clark, who's now with Defenders of Wildlife on the other side of the carrying case, and David Parsons, who was the recovery coordinator, who actually cut through all the bureaucracy and made the reintroduction happen. And ultimately, wolves were released then, and with subsequent releases, it's important to point out they were family packs that were released. And despite a lot of problems, which I don't have time to get into all of them, there was a very high proportion of survival among those wolves that weren't removed from the wild or subject to illegal killing, and oftentimes placed in vulnerable situations in which it was very hard to protect them. And there's been a lot of changes in management thanks to litigation that the center and our partners, Center for Biological Diversity and our partners, have carried through to get better management of the wolves. And that's led to an expansion of where the wolves can roam. I won't go through all the details, but this line that you see across the southern two-thirds of New Mexico and Arizona more or less indicates where wolves are now allowed to roam freely. And there are some exceptions, but again, I don't have time to get to all the details. And these are the locations of the wolves. The wolves on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation and the San Carlos Indian Reservation are not indicated. This is just the most recent online locations that the Fish and Wildlife Service posts. You can see that there's one wolf in the far left corner of the screen there, a dispersing wolf, as they consistently have done, going northwest on the Mogollon Plateau, and another wolf in the boot heel of New Mexico that's pictured there as well. So the range is slowly expanding beyond the Mogollon Plateau, the area right around the Gila National Forest and Apache National Forest, where the wolves were first only allowed to go. Here's where we are in terms of wolf numbers. And I don't know whether people can see, I'm going to see if I can move this. I'm not sure if that gets shown, if your screen is showing this more than, whoops, went back a little bit, more than it was before. The image of the speakers was blocking part of that chart for me. Actual number of wolves in red, 241 counted, last count at the end of 2022 and the beginning of this year. There were projections before the releases, and that's the green numbers that only went up to 2006, that there would be 102 wolves by that time. And as you can see, there was a shortfall then. And then below those two lines, you'll see number of breeding pairs that would go through 2006. And the breeding pairs were lower than that in 2006, and up through 2016, we're only at 10 breeding pairs. We discontinued the enumeration of breeding pairs here because the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2015 changed the definition of breeding pair, because under the old definition, the standard definition that had been used in the Northern Rocky Mountains, for example, they weren't able to actually get enough breeding pairs to make it match their projections. So they changed the definition to make it a little bit easier to show that making progress. That being said, there clearly has been very significant progress. 241 wolves in the wild is more than we've had in a century in the Southwest. But that's been concurrent with this catastrophic loss of genetic diversity. And I want to be clear as I go into why that's happened, that it's been because of management on behalf of one industry, the livestock industry, the public lands livestock industry in the Southwest, that has never given up on the goal of extinction of the Mexican wolf. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has unfortunately done its bidding. Here's an article from 2005 that talks about proposed restrictions for the wolf program. That's when the Fish and Wildlife Service started slowing down the releases of wolves to the wild. And actually, I want to back up just a little bit, go back to this chart. And I want you to look at the the actual number of wolves, the red line there, between 2003 and 2009. 2003 is when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service handed over key decisions on the ground management of the Mexican wolves to the Arizona Game and Fish Department, which had set up an interagency group that Arizona Game and Fish Department chaired, and that set up protocols for the killing of wolves and their removal alive as well. And at that point, the population declined by about 24% over the next several years. And it started going up again in 2006, and then declined again. In 2009, thanks to litigation by Center for Biological Diversity and many of our partners in the nonprofit conservation community, the authority over which wolves lived and which wolves died was transferred back to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the population started going up again. But there was a significant downfall thanks to state management that was essentially on behalf of the livestock industry. And that's what I want to talk about, is the mechanics of that. First of all, Fish and Wildlife Service started proposing restrictions for the wolf program. As it happened, the last year that the government released well-bonded families of wolves from captivity to the wild was 2006. And by well-bonded, I mean an adult pair, a male and female wolf, that had been together for long enough to establish bonds. These are social animals, and pups that they were raising together. The last time they did that was in 2006, and then they repeatedly talked about how they intended to continue releasing wolves to the wild, but they never quite got around to it. Now, they were very upfront at the beginning that it was because the livestock industry was opposed to releases of wolves from captivity to the wild. But then the story changed. There was at one point a forest fire that changed the area where they were planning. They could have released the wolves where there was no forest fire, but they canceled. Other times there was wolves that were in the area where they were planning to release wolves. And again, they could have put them somewhere else, but they canceled. And I think this press release from 2010 really tells the story quite well. Anticipated release of Mexican wolves delayed until 2011. Well, I'll cut to the chase here. They didn't release them in 2011, nor in 2012, nor in 2013. It ended. But here's the rationale. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with the Arizona Game and Fish Department, announced today that the planned release of wolves, blah, 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 will be postponed until sometime in 2011. And then the service, after coordinating with its partners, determined that a release at this time would not be possible. And you can read on, but the essence of it is they didn't want to. They didn't want to release wolves, and that was the explanation. It's not going to work out quite well right now. So these wolves stayed in captivity. That was part of how the genetic diversity went into a steep decline. And the other way was through removing wolves from the wild. This is the airplane used to shoot the wolves in the wild. It has the advantage of being a slow-moving airplane. So as the plane goes over a radio-collared wolf or the wolf's pack mates, that may the gunner can shoot the wolves from the air. Ultimately, the U.S. government has shot 21 of the wolves in the wild on behalf of the livestock industry. And in addition to that, they've accidentally killed 24 wolves as a consequence of their capture. Let's look at this memo from 2004 that talks about the consequences genetically. This is about the decision on one particular wolf from the saddle pack of Mexican wolves. His family had been one by one trapped, but he had managed to avoid being trapped. And there was a decision to be made about whether he should be killed, even though in the meantime he'd stopped killing livestock and had been seen feeding on an elk. And I want you just to, this is a memo from one Fish and Wildlife Service person to another in April of 2004. In the second paragraph there, around the center, it says that a wolf would be euthanized, which is definitely a euphemism. It's not a good death, but would be euthanized only after a determination by the Mexican wolf recovery coordinator that the wolf had no further value to the recovery program. In the case with this wolf, M574, he has significant value to the recovery program as a whole, in that he is the most genetically valuable wolf in the wild, but more significantly, he is ranked number 6 genetically overall in the Mexican wolf in the recovery program includes both the wild population plus the captive wolves throughout the United States and Mexico. In hindsight, it is questionable that he was ever released to the wild because he is so high ranking, i.e., he is not considered surplus or genetically redundant. Because of this, all attempts should be made to capture him alive. And despite this memo, Fish and Wildlife Service went ahead and had him killed, and he was killed in July of 2004. And then many wolves trapped and taken into captivity. This is a bait, an olfactory bait, where there's something smells interesting on that piece of bone there, and there was a trap presumably set this is in 2012 for the trapping of the Fox Mountain pack. A trap set in that open area right in front of it where a wolf would set foot when it was sniffing at the bone. So many wolves removed from the wild, entire pups dug up from their dens and placed in crates and taken into captivity. As I said, 24 wolves accidentally killed as a result of being removed from the wild, but others that just couldn't be bred because there wasn't enough room in the captive population, and that prevented breeding of other wolves in captivity during this entire time. So much so that in 2010, biologists who were looking at the collapse that was ongoing then and had happened over the last several years in genetic diversity published a study that explained what they were doing as a last ditch attempt, vitrification, which is essentially freezing for long term of oocytes, eggs from female wolves, from endangered Mexican gray wolves. They were making a last ditch attempt to save genetic diversity by freezing the eggs of the wolves in hopes that future technological advances would enable them to create live wolves in a manner that wasn't available in 2010, and I believe is still not available, on the basis of conserving the genetic diversity that was disappearing right in front of them, and they were unable to persuade Fish and Wildlife Service and Arizona Game and Fish and the other agencies to conserve in real time. Here's a picture of one of the wolves. This is the poster wolf of the program, one of the first 11 wolves released, and I think this is an Arizona Game and Fish Department photograph, and Fish and Wildlife Service accidentally killed her after removing her from the wild. But they've also reduced the genetic diversity through a program of delegating the killing of Mexican wolves to the livestock industry. And it's not an official program, but it's really worth looking at how this is done. This is the back cover of the Cattle Growers Association magazine from a few years ago. And it's got the wolf lovers phrase, wolves belong, but in this case, wolves may belong, but not around my calves. It shows a livestock owner who successfully shot 2 wolves. And look at the tableau there. You have a cow and calf, but it doesn't look like they've been attacked by wolves. In fact, the tracks don't even show anything, doesn't even show them particularly disturbed. So it's with a wink and a nod, an encouragement to the illegal killing of wolves. And over 200 wolves have either been illegally killed or have disappeared under suspicious circumstances, including a lot of radio-colored wolves. Now, telemetry and telemetry receivers that can track wolves by their radio collars, and then the GPS technology that can track wolves from a computer far away. Very powerful technologies for government officials, such as the people I've just in front of you and people I've just shown, to track the wolves. But that technology is being given by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and its state game department partners to individuals who hate the wolves, and that's coincided with a huge number of wolves that have been found illegally killed, such as this unfortunate wolf killed in the Gila National Forest. So let's look a little bit at what's going on with this provision of telemetry receivers. And this is some more documents we got through the Freedom of Information Act from the Fish and Wildlife Service. This is from 2007. I want to point out, from just in showing you this, that the government, for the likely disappearance of alpha male 512 of the Aspen pack, right now the field team feels that this wolf is dead, and they talk about which wolf has joined the pack and the timing being peak breeding season. And then the Aspen pack was located outside of the normal territory. And prior to that, they had been consistently within their territory. We had just given, and then the name is redacted, we had just given so-and-so a receiver. That's a telemetry receiver to enable this individual to track the wolves by their the frequencies on their radio collars. We had just given this person a receiver just prior to this. So him or her leaving coincidental with the wolves being in the area, coincidental to this uncolored wolf likely being dead, seems questionable. Just a lot of coincidences along the way. Also, the reports and upset people about aspen, the aspen pack, has died down completely here recently. Thus, I imagine that a few people may know about the deal. And now to just sit quiet and quit complaining about the deal. Anyways, just the ramblings of a suspicious mind at this stage, nothing to confirm, no body. So that's a suspicion, but let's look at what we know for sure. Here's something else from the Freedom of Information Act. And whoops, sorry, that's going backwards here. This is about providing updated telemetry receivers to various, various livestock owners. And it says other receivers that will need to be updated. And I just want to point you to two names on this list. The fifth name down there, I'm sorry, the first name there, Ron Rains, and then the fourth name, Craig Thiessen. So remember those two names. This is from, and unfortunately, I'm unable to see the entirety of my screen here, but I think maybe you all can. I believe that's from 2016, but I'm not, it might be from a couple years before, but several years before actually. But in any event, two of these individuals were actually involved in illegal killings of wolves. And you can see in this press release from the Department of Justice, Ron Rains was shot and killed a wolf. And this is just a continuation of the press release, that court records reflect that 2 days earlier, Rains had been notified that a wolf was in the vicinity of the area in which he killed the wolf, and yet killed the wolf nonetheless. And this individual, after this happened, was still receiving updated telemetry receivers from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to locate other wolves. And then I mentioned another name here, and this is another press release, Craig Thiessen, convicted in 2015 of illegally killing a wolf. So these are individuals who had this technology to enable them to locate the wolves. And Dr. Hedrick and colleagues did a study that was published in 2007 that connected the more inbred wolves, the ones that are more closely related, having pups, to having smaller litter sizes. But in 2009, the Fish and Wildlife Service ramped up the feeding of the wolves, and essentially, even as the genetic diversity was declining, the impacts on reproduction were being masked by this feeding of the wolves. That was up to 70% of the breeding wolves were getting feeding in the wild. The solution is to resume the family releases of wolves. And in fact, the survival rate of pups with families that are not persecuted subsequent to release and in areas with adequate native prey is far higher than when pups are taken from their parents and released into the dens of unrelated or less related wolves in the wild. There's no reason that the moms and dads and brothers and sisters can't be released with these wolves for the greater survival of the pups. The releases of pups without their parents began in 2016. A total of 83 pups have been released. The majority of them have disappeared. Nobody knows whether they're alive or dead, but it's not a good sign that they haven't been seen again. And 14 of those 83 are known to be alive today. Hopefully a lot more of those are alive. But that's why, yes, there's been an uptick in the genetics, but it's such an insufficient uptick that we only had, as Dr. Hedrick mentioned, we only have 2.1 founder genome equivalents from among those 7 founders originally. And part of the solution has to be, and this is from another study that that looked at what the criteria should be for recovery, has to be connectivity to Mexican wolf populations, as Dr. Hedrick indicated, further north. And this is a map from that study. And you can see if you look beyond the thick black lines, you can see the outline of the 4 corners and northern Rocky states. And these black lines indicate potential habitat linkages where a wolf is, the thicker the line is more likely to survive going in these particular routes than other routes to potentially get between potential populations. The number 6 down at the bottom is the current population of Mexican wolves. Number 5 is where the Grand Canyon ecosystem is. Number 4 is the Southern Rocky Mountains on the border of New Mexico and Colorado. And then you can see potential connectivity to wolves in the Northern Rocky Mountains. Number 2 is Central Idaho. Number 3 up there is Yellowstone, and further and up at the very top is northwestern Montana. So there's good reason to establish populations both of Mexican wolves in the Grand Canyon and in the Southern Rocky Mountains in order to have enough wolves so that they can go back and forth through this larger area to actually save them genetically, including having connectivity from the north. And having a wolf population in the Grand Canyon is a key part. A Mexican wolf population is a key part of this, but current regulations require the Fish and Wildlife Service to remove wolves that are north of Interstate 40. That's thanks to Arizona Game and Fish demands, which is on behalf of the livestock industry, and also on behalf of their trophy hunting clients as well. And it's particularly important to establish a Mexican wolf population in the southern Rocky Mountains as part of the reintroduction that is being planned, that voters in Colorado called for as well. And that could allow for the intergradation of genetics from north to south that Dr. Hedrick described. We have two choices in the road here, or in the proverbial path. We can go forward with a scientific-based management that I just outlined and that Dr. Hedrick explained the genetic basis for, or we can continue on this outline of controlling the wolves, killing them on behalf of the livestock industry, releasing them only under circumstances where very few of them actually end up contributing genetically. And we can have a long, slow decline. And the dawn that so many of us hoped for from the Mexican wolf that began with the reintroduction 25 years ago on March 29th, 1998, could turn out, if we continue on the present politicized course that Fish and Wildlife Service, Arizona Game and Fish Department, and their constituency in the livestock industry want, that could turn into a sunset where we now in this generation can see wolf tracks, we can experience this wildness. But there is a question as to whether that will be the case 50 years or 75 years if we don't take a different course. Thank you very much. And I should mention, we'd love to have people join the Center for Biological Diversity as members and supporters so that we can continue our fight for Mexican wolves and also for all types of endangered and imperiled animals and plants and their habitats and their climate. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Michael. We have lots of great questions here. So we're going to try to go ahead and get through as many of these as we can. And if we don't get to your question today, definitely send me an email. I'm happy to put together more resources and make sure we're answering everyone's questions. So let's see. We've got a question that relates to climate change. So possibly both Michael Robinson and Dr. Hedrick might want to speak to this. With the advancement of climate change, wouldn't it make more sense to recover Mexican wolves in the large core of high elevation Sierra Madre, where they're evolved, rather than the already arid and fragmented Grand Canyon area north of their historical range? So maybe I'll go to Michael first, and then maybe Dr. Hedrick for comments about climate change and how that might impact the range that is suitable for Mexican gray wolves.
It is vitally important to recover the Mexican gray wolf in the Sierra Madres as the heart of their historical range, as a subspecies that was conceived of in an era when there was much more delineation of potential subspecies, and the differences between them, the nuanced differences were seen as definitive of different subspecies. The Mexican wolf was seen as being essentially the Sierra Madre and the Sky Island Mountains subspecies. Now we see it more broadly and see the linkages and can theorize that something so close to the Mexican wolf is also found in its current range in the Gila and the like. But yes, it's absolutely important to recover them in the Sierra Madres, but it's also important, as obviously climate change will shift the climates that we've been used to, historically for so long, from south to north, that higher elevation areas, including in the southern Rocky Mountains, that have very high numbers of elk, be available for Mexican wolves. The original wolf, whether you wanted to call it a Mexican wolf or what it was originally identified as, a southern Rocky Mountain wolf, Canis lupus youngi, that species that went extinct in subspecies, if it was a subspecies, was killed off in 1945, with the last one killed in the South San Juans. Mexican wolves were very closely related. They should also be there, and there should be connectivity between wolves in the southern Rocky Mountains, the Grand Canyon, the Gila and Apache National Forest and environs, and the Sierra Madres of Mexico. There should be connectivity throughout all of them to take advantage of all remaining suitable habitat, particularly on public lands that should be devoted to public uses primarily, such as recovery of endangered wildlife. So it shouldn't be a this versus that, but rather all of it, because that's what the Mexican wolf needs at this point. I'm done.
Thank you, Michael. And Dr. Hedrick, any comments about climate change and how that might impact range and recovery?
Well, I mentioned that a little bit, but as Michael was saying, further north now is good habitat. I showed you that historic range for Mexican wolves. So Mexican wolves can certainly live further north than that historic habitat. So there's no reason why they can't expand northward. And I guess the other thing is, it's great that Mexican wolves might be doing well in Mexico, but that's a whole different question. That doesn't have anything to do with recovery of wolves in the US. So I think there's no real impact of that on what we should be thinking about doing in the US. We hope that that works out well. Remember, there's no connection across the border, so we're not going to get wolves coming from Mexico to the US. There's a wall there, so that's not going to help genetically or in other ways to the US population. So I think that's a separate issue, recovery in Mexico. We could support it, but that's not going to help recovery in the US.
And can I just add one kind of thing, and a little bit of a nuanced look at the border between the US and Mexico. The wall has done terrible damage, and the Center for Biological Diversity is advocating that it be torn down. That said, thankfully, there are areas where the wall has not been constructed, that wolves and other endangered wildlife and wildlife altogether can still cross. And there have been crossings in some of these areas. Some areas where wolves crossed have been blocked off, but other areas haven't. And in large part, it's management, the decision by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Arizona Game and Fish Department, for example, to capture a wolf who came up from Mexico about 7 or 8 years ago and was at the edge of the Chiricahuas and in an area that still hasn't had a wall built since then. Well, they captured her and she's still in captivity. So it's the wall has curtailed connectivity, but it's really management as it's currently conceived that makes it so less likely that wolves can have effective connectivity.
Right, thank you both. All right, we are having some kind of discussion in our Q&A about Mexico. Original question was how many wolves are in Mexico currently. I believe we've heard a tally of about 40 to 45, as far as I know, but there are also some questions about survivorship in Mexico. And I'm not sure if either of you would like to speak to that at all, if you're aware of anything. One of our attendees has shared that they believe average survivorship is about 6 months on average in Mexico. So any information that either of you have about that, either an updated count or comments on perhaps some of the challenges faced in Mexico that are maybe a little bit different than what we might be familiar with here in the US. Protections for wolves, challenges faced by wolves. Any comments about that?
I'll be very brief. It's really sad to hear that, and I don't know if that's correct, but I have no reason to doubt that about 6 months survivorship. I will say that there is no elk in the wild in Mexico. That is one of the differences and one of the advantages that potential advantages we have for being able to expand the wolf population here. And we have an extensive system of public lands in the US, which also can make it, avoids some of the challenges in a nation that has a different system of land stewardship and ownership. So those are just some of the challenges, but nonetheless, it's vitally important that recovery be pursued in both nations. And I do believe that some level of connectivity can help and can be established and help in the long run. I'm done.
Thanks, Michael. Dr. Hedrick, any comments about that?
No, I don't have any firsthand information.
Thank you. And I would just like to reiterate, recovery in Mexico is absolutely crucial. And, even when we talk about challenges and limited survivorship, we still want to be fully supportive of this is a binational recovery effort. It takes collaboration and cooperation across borders, across political divides. And we would love to see a landscape where we have continuity of gray wolves and Mexican gray wolves, ranging throughout the Western US and down into Mexico. So full support for recovery in Mexico. All right, a few more questions here. Let's see, let me circle back. We've got a question about captive raised adults. So 8 of the 9 adult captive raised wolves released, including 2 pairs, did not contribute any genetics to the wild population because of conflicts, but fostering genetically valuable pups is improving the genetic health of the wild population with minimal conflict. What benefit do you think would be gained by releasing habituated adult wolves out of zoos into a rapidly increasing population? So if either of you have comments about that, feel free.
I'd like to take that on. And first of all, when the term habituated wolves that Arizona Game and Fish Department throws out there in a prejudicial way in these kind of discussions really serves to obscure more than it serves to eliminate. And the thing that was briefly mentioned but not given enough focus in that in the phrasing of that question is didn't make it due to conflicts. And this is because of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Arizona Game and Fish Department's determination to not require any preventative measures, even on public lands, for owners of livestock to protect their livestock, and instead to scapegoat the wolves in the instances which are recurring over and over again, in which cattle die of non-wolf causes. They die from disease or poisonous weeds, or even in our drought years, sometimes what appears to be starvation, or lightning strikes, or birthing problems. And wolves smell the carrion from maybe even a mile or 2 away. And it happens over and over again in the same parts of the national forests. The wolves are drawn to the rotting meat, and they eat it, they feed on it. And then where there's dead wolves, dead cattle, there's typically dying cattle, and the wolves end up preying on livestock, and then the helicopter is sent out and they're shot. Now that's not a valid criticism when those wolves don't make it, or when their pups are orphaned because they've been captured and removed. The adults have captured and removed, and some of the pups weren't captured with them and didn't make it. That is not an indictment of releasing wolves as family packs, where the actual survival rate of the pups in the known survival rate is significantly higher than when the pups are taken from their parents and released to relatively unrelated wolves. Instead, those failures are an indictment of the management regimen set up by Arizona Game and Fish and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that encourages negligent and reckless husbandry of cattle that are reimbursed for if they are killed by wolves, and that leads directly to conflicts, and then that the government spends taxpayer money on removing the wolves following the conflicts. So I reject the premise. The premise is based on a whole series of management decisions that don't reflect the actual question of how wolves are released.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Hedrick, any comments to add to that?
Nothing in particular, but it seems like some of these questions are involved around really not recovery of Mexican wolves. It's around protecting the cattle industry, limiting the area where wolves can be. So seems like this whole approach that Game and Fish, Arizona Game and Fish in particular, is supporting is one that's contrary to the actual recovery of Mexican wolves on a scientific basis. So when I was on the recovery team, we had representatives from scientists and a diversity of different people. Then the recovery team was changed, and virtually all the people were from Game and Fish departments. And the whole goal of recovery of Mexican wolves changed from having multiple subpopulations connected and expanding populations to having one population with a limited number. So I think you're seeing here this kind of Game and Fish attitude of having as few wolves and as limited recovery as possible. That's what I'm seeing in these questions we're getting.
Thank you, Dr. Hedrick. We've got time for maybe a couple more questions. We've got a question here. Can you distinguish the policies of Arizona Game and Fish and New Mexico Fish and Wildlife, for New Mexico fishing game? The attendee is saying, if they remember correctly, the poster showed advocating wolf killing was from New Mexico Fish and Wildlife. So this might be a question about Michael's presentation, maybe a little clarification about some of our state policies.
Yeah, Arizona Game and Fish has for the most part been the leader in the pushback against scientific management of these wolves, but at various times they have succeeded in pulling New Mexico and Game and Fish Department in under their sway, and New Mexico Game and Fish Department, you know, has very readily gone along. We had a period of very strong conservationist leadership in New Mexico under Governor Bill Richardson a number of years back. And since then, there's been either less directed conservationist leadership, and the New Mexico Game and Fish has had its own way, so to speak, with policy, or in fact adverse leadership that's directing them away. But it was interesting that when Governor Richardson started questioning, and his point, he started questioning why wolf populations were going down in a recovery program after Arizona Game and Fish Department started taking the lead, and the Game Commission and the Game Department in New Mexico started for the first time actually saying, does this wolf need to be shot actually? And objected, in fact, to the killing of a wolf in New Mexico. And we've got this in writing, and I'm sure Arizona Game and Fish will be interested in seeing this. But Arizona Game and Fish advocated for the shooting of a wolf in New Mexico. They said the rules are the rules. That's not verbatim, of course. You know, we got to get rid of this wolf. You know, they don't use phrases like "get rid of it." You know, antiseptic phrases like control, lethal control, and the like. But Arizona Game and Fish has really been a leader in standing up for the livestock industry against the wolves. They've been quite happy to go beyond their state's borders and try and lead in New Mexico, and sometimes they've managed to persuade in a very amenable New Mexico Game and Fish, and other times when there's been pushback, Arizona Game and Fish has insisted this wolf still has to be killed.
Thanks, Michael. Time for maybe one more question here, maybe one or two. Question, what can average residents, community members do to assist in releases of wolf families and to restrict removal of wolves from the wild? Anything those of us at home can take action on?
I'm going to jump in again, and Dr. Hedrick, please follow me with additional thoughts. I mean, bottom line is we live in a democracy, and it's critically important to let your elected officials, whether they're members of Congress or the governors in particular of these states, know that you're very concerned about the loss of genetic diversity. You understand, despite the agency obfuscation, that well-bonded family groups do better and they should be released again, and that removals on behalf of the livestock industry, no matter what kind of nice packaging and rhetoric accompanies them, are almost always detrimental and certainly always cruel. You know, the Center for Biological Diversity, we're in court constantly. We are in 2 lawsuits against these recalcitrant agencies that left to their own accord would be driving the Mexican wolf, you know, to a desperate situation. And we're going to continue to get reform. So we certainly welcome people who want to join with us. But, you know, you can do so much. You can write letters to the editor. You can, you know, we're happy to make appearances and talk to groups of people, and definitely get on our website, www.biologicaldiversity.org, to get updates on what you can do at specific times.
Thank you. Dr. Hedrick, anything to add to that?
I don't have anything.
All right. Well, I can add that, you know, we also have a lot of information up on MexicanWolves.org, and anytime there's something new to take action on or participate in, we try to post news there. So if you haven't already, make sure you sign up there and check out MexicanWolves.org for lots more information. We try to collect a lot of resources from many different conservation partners as well. So you won't just be hearing from us, you'll be hearing from lots of organizations and lots of volunteers who are doing great work on the ground. I do want to thank both of you, Dr. Hedrick, Michael Robinson, so much for the fantastic information. We are going to share a recording after this. I also want to thank everyone who attended. I know we didn't get to all of your questions. So apologies if we missed you. There was some awesome conversation happening in our Q&A here, but just really appreciate everyone. If we didn't get to your question and you'd like an answer, please feel free to send me an email. My email address is Erin, E-R-I-N, @MexicanWolves.org. Once again, ERIN @MexicanWolves.org. You can send me an email and I'll make sure to follow up with you individually to make sure your question gets answered and we share any resources that will be helpful. So I want to thank you all again. Really appreciate everyone's time here today. Any closing remarks from either Michael or Dr. Hedrick?
Just thank you, Erin, and thank you, Dr. Hedrick, and thank you to everybody who took time out of your day to listen in and contribute to the conversation.
And thank you for the opportunity to participate. Thanks, Michael and Erin, for organizing. Erin.
All right, thank you both. And we're getting lots of thanks in the Q&A as well. So just thank you so much to everyone for being involved. We're going to go ahead and close out here. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll send a follow-up email with all of our recording. And if you reach out to me for any resources or questions, definitely we'll get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Indeed.